Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast. This is your host, Natasha Helfer Parker, and I am very pleased to have an episode today where I have invited some really special guests. George and Alyson Deussen, I hope I'm saying that correctly, are going to be joining us to talk about some difficult things. They have a son who identified as gay and died of suicide several years ago after the exclusion policy of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And among other things, we're going to talk about, their response to the reversal of that policy just this last week. So we have a lot of things that we're going to hopefully dive into. Before we do that, just a little plug for Mormon Mental Health Podcast for those of you who enjoy this show. It is a podcast that is dependent on listener support. There's a very handy dandy donation button on the mormonmentalhealth.org page, which if you want to help this podcast stay alive, you can go there and push a button, make a one-time donation or kind of like a subscription type of donation, like once a month or once a week. And any bit will do, even just a few dollars to, if you can really afford more than that to keep this podcast going. The goal is about $10,000 a year to help me cover all the costs, including people who help me edit and reimbursing for them for their time, etc. So we'd love to keep this going for you. So if you find value in it, that would be really, really appreciated. And for all of those of you who do already donate, I just want to say thank you so much for supporting this. If you want to donate, but maybe don't want to do that financially, or want to help, I guess, there are other ways. You can like our Mormon Mental Health Facebook page. You can write us a positive review on the Facebook page or on iTunes. That helps spread the word. You can share, of course, these podcasts on your social media with people that might, be helped out by some of the things that we talk about. Also, if you want to know anything else that I'm up to, because I give presentations or have other resources available, you can always go to my personal webpage, which is natashaparker.org. and kind of check out other things that you might be interested in. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, George and Alyson, welcome to the program. So glad that you're joining us today.
Thanks.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, especially because we had this originally planned like a few days ago and my Zoom kind of imploded. My whole program imploded. So thank you for being willing to come back and deal with rescheduling issues. But I'd like to just start with kind of giving you both some time to just introduce yourselves, who you are, how you come to be members of the church, what your relationship, with the church has been in the past, and just kind of lead us up to the time when, you were kind of dealing with your son's coming out process and, kind of your relationship with the church. So just kind of an initial introduction.
You want to start?
Sure. So our son came out at age 13, which was how long ago? 7 years ago. About.
Yeah, 7.
So 7 years ago, he came out at 13. And at the time, we probably didn't take it as serious as we thought we should. We kind of thought it was maybe a phase and that he didn't really recognize or understand what that really meant. And so with the advice of a therapist, we kind of decided to just kind of write it out with him. And so initially I wouldn't say we were negative, but I wouldn't say that we were just all on board with him. We just kind of thought we would not say a ton about it and just kind of see where it went. And it was pretty evident fairly soon after, this was 7th grade, by about 8th grade, that we were, in this for the long haul, and we needed to kind of rethink where things were at.
Can you start us off even before then? Like kind of like before, like how do you come to be LDS folks to begin with? Are you converts to the church? Are you, were you both kind of born into the church? How do you happen to be a Mormon family?
Mormonism has been a part of our lives,
both
pretty
we were
much
born
for the very beginning.
Members.
And so we've been in the Mormon faith pretty much all of our lives.
So my kids, our kids have grown up in the church, attending, participating. Stockton has 2 older sisters who were 4 and 5 years older than him. And, all of the kids, we had that expectation of our kids that until they left our home, that was something as a family that we did. And so we always were participating on every level with callings and activities and all those kinds of things.
Okay, so you were very active. You were very actively involved at the point that your son was starting adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
And did this come as a big surprise then when he came out to you? Was this something you kind of saw coming, or it was a total kind of out of the blue conversation?
I think that for the most part we kind of went along with an understanding that the Mormon Church is the posturing and position of the church towards homosexuality and as they reference SSA. So we didn't really know any better. We have had interactions and relationships with folks in the LGBTQ community throughout our lives, and not necessarily supported it, but not necessarily tried to be negative towards it. So when Stockton came out, we just didn't know any better, to be honest. And I think that what we tried to gain was, in the Mormon tradition, you go to your leaders, and your leaders are supposed to have answers. And you go to the network within the community for answers, because that's supposed to be the safe space. And so we sought after, LDS approved relationships in the therapeutic community. And so we were just trying to find some answers. And so we honestly followed that.
And were any of those answers, you talked about a therapist who kind of gave you maybe some initial guidelines, and what about the church itself? Was this something that Stockton talked about to his bishop, or that you as a family went and tried to get some ecclesiastical support, or what was the church involvement at that point of the coming out process? And were they an asset or neutral or negative at that point?
No, Stockton never did talk to his leaders. When he entered into Young Men's, he got the first Strength of the Youth pamphlet, and there's a part in there that talks about homosexuality and that it's a sin and that you need to talk to your bishop. And Stockton specifically said in an interview that we did that was the first time that he'd seen something that really didn't sit well with him, and that he wasn't a sinner and that he wasn't, bad, but yet here was a book that he received saying so. And so for him, it just kind of left a bitter taste in his mouth. But at that point, we were still kind of grappling. At that point, there wasn't a lot of resources. Mama Dragons had just started, and Mormons Building Bridges is where I kind of started connecting to parents that had LGBT teens specifically. And so I kind of just quietly tried to find resources. And then when I finally did say something to our leaders, it was really almost, we really didn't have much conversation until Stockton wanted to attend a scout camp, for which parents had heard through the grapevine that he was gay, and had the night before they came to us and said that if he went, then these kids aren't going. And so could George come and attend?
Yeah, so
these were members of your ward that were concerned about.
Yeah, so we had members of our ward that went to our bishop and basically just said, if Stockton's going to go on this activity, then either our boys won't go or there's going to have to be supervision. And so the bishop actually came to me and just said, George, you have to go. And so it was just a pretty powerful message that we were receiving and that Stockton was receiving.
Wow. So in other words, your kid is dangerous to our kids.
Right.
Yeah. Basically, if your son is around our sons, then we're scared. We're worried.
Wow. And the bishop didn't stand up to that or say that's ridiculous.
No, they actually ended up holding a meeting. I actually was out of town, and so he called me, and I'm a little bit feistier than George, so I was not too happy with the scenario. And so they ultimately that night held a meeting, which of course did not include George or I, and with the other parents, and they came to the conclusion that all of the kids would sleep under the stars and that the leaders would be, off away from them, but still under the stars as well, so that there would be an eye on all the boys. And so that was kind of the resolution. But at that point, we had already had to go to Stockton and say, hey, if you go to scout camp, most likely you're going to have to probably sleep in your own tent. And, his first questions are, why?
Wow.
Well, yeah, if you know Stockton, our biggest concern for Stockton was that he was going to bring a rodent home, or he might start a fire. He just he just was incredibly harmless, and for him to be receiving the messaging from, like Alyson said, from the For Strength of Youth pamphlet, and then just this really stark, dark messaging from church leaders. It was just sending a big message.
So right away then, because even the organizations that you mentioned, Alyson, Mama Dragons and Building Bridges, Mormons Building Bridges, just so everybody understands, those are not groups or organizations that are sponsored by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Those are groups that have kind of created themselves out of grassroots movements because, in essence, there is no support really coming from the official church for families like yours or teens like Stockton. Is that something you would agree with?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, even the Mormon and Gay website was not even out at that point. And so, one of my biggest arguments when I did finally meet with the bishop and everybody after this scout camp was, you guys want us to be aligned with the church. However, there's no resources available that help us align and know how to manage it. And not only that, you're not willing to talk about it.
And then the interactions you are starting to have with your ward are extremely damaging to a young teenager, right? Teenagers struggle anyway, right? Without added struggle. Most teenagers struggle with feeling like they fit in or being talked about or feeling other in some way. Or, they do a lot of that to themselves to begin with. And then you have this added kind of community space where they're pushing that kind of message as well.
Well, and Stockton was, it was interesting. I always use this phrase that he was okay with being gay. What he wasn't okay with was being lonely. And, we at the time were in Bountiful, Utah, and, your church friends equate to your neighbors and equate to your schoolmates. And once that tie disconnects, it makes it very difficult for a youth to, manage and to navigate being alone.
Yeah, it's challenging enough, like you mentioned, just being a teenager. And so the spaces that ultimately should have been safe and loving and warm for him just were not. They were completely the opposite. And so that was kind of our space rapidly at the beginning when Stockton came out. And so we had a very perplexing, challenging, conversation with ourselves individually and collectively. And we had to make some pretty quick decisions to where we're going to lay our focus and our commitment.
Meaning, so, and just to kind of recap, and by the way, I see that several people are joining us and watching. So just for those who are, I just want you to know that this is meant to be interactive. So feel free to ask a question or give a comment. I've already seen several little hearts go up, in the Facebook. So obviously people sending love your way. So anyway, just feel free to interact with us. But just to get a picture, it seems like you were a very active family, very involved in your community, very, believing and, doing the Mormon thing per se. And it sounds like Stockton, other than, having read this, excerpt in the youth pamphlet, that he also was very committed and felt like the church was a huge part of his identity and belief system. Was that how you would characterize him?
Oh, I think he was a typical teen. I don't know that he was committed. I mean, that was what we did.
That was our family.
Our family.
We were Mormons, and we went to church and we did the Mormon thing.
He enjoyed it.
Yeah,
he didn't like basketball with the young men every Tuesday, but he had friends. I mean, I remember for a long time, he and one of our neighbors would, after church, take our dogs and go for walks and go visit their Sunday school teacher and, those kinds of things. And those things changed.
It was his community. I mean, we all need community. It's really important to our, health and well-being. And he was his community. And so he was
our community. Yeah, it was all of our community.
It was our base. It was our community. And yeah.
So I think what you're describing then is that, okay, now this community that we've been a part of, this church, our belief systems, the whole thing, we now have to take a real look at, because we're noticing that there's some potential damage here or harm, or there's some rejection behavior going on. And we're realizing this isn't maybe a space that our kiddo should have to navigate. Is that what you mean by that? Like having to rethink things?
At that point, I don't think we were rethinking things. I kind of chalked it up to the fact that, we had a learning curve. And so our leaders and the young men and women leaders also were in that space. They didn't quite understand. And of course, George and I had the quick and dirty, 101 of that, and that they just needed to have just like at the intro. And so I would go to the young men leaders and I would say, I know this is new. I know you don't understand, but I would love to sit down with you and just talk about it and help you understand. And you can ask me any questions. It will be safe. We went to the bishop. We provided him with some, like the Family Acceptance Project. We invited him to an affirmation priesthood, our leadership seminar. And of course, they turn it over and look that it's not produced by the church, and it gets set back on the credenza behind them. And so every turn, I would ask the bishop, I'd say, hey, Stockton plays the guitar beautifully, and his older sister does. Would you ever, let him play in sacrament meeting? And he did, but it was everything I had to suggest. Or I'd go to the young men leaders and say, Stockton is a great swimmer. If you ever want him to come and teach flip turns at the swimming pool, and for, the young men, I know he'd love it to just be included, because at that point he was going to probably just sacrament meeting with us. Yeah, we kind of relented and just said, just come to sacrament meeting and then you can go.
Yeah. And we were, as much as we were going through this process, we felt very strongly at the time that our, the spiritual community, the Mormon community, was a place that we needed to hang on to. And we were trying in different ways. And as Alyson so well just pointed out, we were trying to get our leaders to minister to Stockton, that he had differences, that he needed different attention, a different focus. And the only way you really attend to anybody is that you get to know them. And so we were trying to get our leaders to get to know Stockton and engage him in a way that would be welcoming, so that he felt like it was a space that he could go to that would be safe.
So what was his take? Why was he only going to sacrament meeting? What was he saying? What was he feeling? Was it about the feeling like he was being ostracized for being gay, or was it more like, oh, church, right? Kind of like you're saying, right? Like,
I think it was both.
I mean, he was, like I said, a typical teenager. So he, it was both. He would rather be, reading a book or sleeping or, the teenage things that kids like. And so, but he didn't hum and haw about sacrament meeting. And interestingly enough, he was still attending seminary.
He loved seminary.
So that was one thing he had really connected. And I had actually gone to the seminary principal and kind of said, we've not had a great experience. And I'm hoping that if he's going to take seminary, that you can provide a safe space, because I promise you, he's not the only teen in this place.
So you were being fairly proactive as parents. I mean, you're talking to the seminary teacher, you're talking to the young men's leaders, you're trying to talk.
We're trying to talk to the stake, but they won't
we
let
just
us make an appointment.
We volunteered with our stake and with our bishopric and the ward. We just said, listen, we're trying to learn this. And at that point, we knew we had come to the understanding of the percentages within the communities that would be in the LGBT community. And so we knew that there were other young men, young women in the stake that were, going through this process. And parents.
And
can you share that as you're talking? Like, what were you finding out? What were some of those statistics?
Well, between 4% and 6% were kind of the numbers. And so, if you started to look at the statistics, each ward, would have X number of adults or young kids who identify as such. And so, and we were starting to find out here and there kids that had either come out or people that had other children that were LGBT. And so, we were saying, let's provide some support for these parents, because I felt really alone.
Yeah, we felt alone, and we knew what that felt like personally. And so as we gathered the data and understood what the data really looked like, we went to our bishop and stake and said, hey, we know this is here. The data tells us the truth. And so let us be a resource so we can all learn together and we can gain knowledge so that we can love and support the kids and the parents in this process. Because even though it might be a bit different, we need this support, and our kids need this love. And
so other than the example that you gave me about, your ward community being scared of your son going on a camp out with their sons, what was the basic kind of reaction that you were getting? Were people welcoming your thoughts and your ideas? Were they kind of
I think that he
wasn't completely out. I mean, he didn't make a social media post or anything. And so, I would guess that mostly like the young men, young women leaders knew, those people that would maybe go to Bishop's Council and the bishopric and maybe some of the youth, but it wasn't like our whole ward really knew. And then, we'd walk in and you'd see them bolt the other direction usually.
Yeah, they would run for the hills like the devil had walked in the building. But this was, we needed to take care of Stockton, and we wanted him to be received and loved. And so we were on a mission, and we really honestly became the big elephant in the room.
Yeah, they never took us up on our offers to, the young men's president and his leaders. They never did take us up on, that offer to say, hey, let's sit down and talk about it.
Yeah. In fact, it wasn't until after Stockton passed away that we had already moved out of the stake. And they had invited us in to speak with the young men, young women leaders, and to kind of give a perspective. And so, I certainly applaud them for making some effort. But I think the key is that we've got to look at these things. And so that process for us was that we realized that we needed to get up to speed and attend to the needs of our son.
Meg Hendricks, by the way, says, hi, dear friends, love you. So Meg is watching.
We love Meg.
So can you tell me what was Stockton's basic experience like, going to school with these kids, going to church with these kids and families? Was he being treated differently? Were people fairly friendly and just kind of ignoring the orientation issue, or were they being more aggressive and rejection types of formats? What was he living on a day-to-day basis?
Well, it was junior high.
Yeah,
so
junior high is kind of a mess
he
anyway.
would say, I told my friend and she promised she wouldn't tell anybody. And I, just kind of roll my eyes and go, Stockton. Well, she promised, she's my best friend.
Right.
And I would say, well, let me tell you, and so he kind of had to learn the hard way that things, I remember he was writing stories about, gay relationships, I guess, if you will. He had a notebook that he liked to write in. And one time some kids took it and took some pictures, and those got spread around the school. And so, I would say the kids were decent to him. I don't think they were mean, but they certainly kept their distance, I think would probably be the best way to describe it.
There was on an occasion, he had shared this conversation with us and said that a peer of his had said, hey, if we can be friends and we can associate it at school, but if my parents know about you being gay, then, so outside of school, I can't spend time with you, and because my parents are going to really be upset.
Wow.
So.
Wow. And these are members of the church, or?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, typically,
Yeah.
yes. Okay. So, so in these communities where there's not a lot of differentiation, right, between the overall community and then the church community, because it's highly Mormon community.
Right.
Okay.
One of the things too that I tried to get them to do, because our bishop was new and, bless his heart, he was the local football coach. So he had probably, the testosterone running on high. But I had grown up in this stake, and the ward I was in, and that my mother actually lived in still, we had a half a dozen to a dozen kids that had kind of I'd say a bit younger than me, that had come out. And I had asked, I was even saying to them, I'm like, what, just have, Bishop so-and-so be a resource to our bishop. And, give him some pointers how he's handled it, because I knew that they had been working with and, helping these youth in the ward that I grew up in. And so I was just trying to say, hey, let's just, get all your bishops in one room and give them some help.
Mm-hmm.
I felt bad for them. They didn't have resources either. I remember I did go to the leadership thing at Affirmation, and Jonathan Manwaring actually showed there was a tools section that the bishops could access. And there was one all on LGBT. And I'd look at that and go, oh, if they just take those 10 tips, they'd be light years ahead.
Yeah.
And
just remind me the timeline. So he's coming out to you when he's about 13. What year is this about?
Well, we're
19,
7 years ago.
7 years. So
2012.
2012. Right. Okay. Because I just want to be very clear with the audience, just from a mental health perspective, that it's not like we didn't know anything about how to help gay people. Okay. In 2012. Right. So the fact that the church had no resources or no programs or no conversation or no dialogue means that they were ignoring a huge amount of mental health research, a huge amount of best care standards of practice, which really we started having much better national resources in the 90s, in the 1990s, kind of after the AIDS epidemic and things of that nature. So anyway, just to point that out to make sure that we understand kind of the national landscape anyway, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. That information has been out for a long, long time, and there definitely is that was available.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So why don't you walk me through the rest of the timeline then, as far as what, 2015 comes along. So now your kiddo's 15, I'm guessing by that point, 15 or 16, by the time the exclusionary policy comes out. What impact, what's your reaction as that, comes out? And
yeah, so just a quick note that I think is important to bring to light. We had, through this process and up until the policy, we had been trying to find a space that Stockton could thrive. And just by the sheer fact that we could, we noticed that, things were just hard for him, and he was lonely, and it was, I believe it was 2013 or 2014. Do you remember?
Probably 13.
The first time that we connected. with affirmation.
Mm.
And it was, that was a good space for him. That was a place that he felt welcomed and loved and appreciated. In fact, we commented several times that it was good to see that light back in him, that he felt like he kind of found his people and his tribe. And so that was really important in his journey, that he was able to find, that space that was so critical that we all need.
Can you speak a little bit more about that? Because maybe some people listening don't know affirmation or what that's about. Can you talk a little bit about what that organization is about, and what in particular did Stockton find, kind of affirming in that space?
Well, affirmation was, or at that time and still is, a support network for anybody that has identified or has a history of being members of the LDS faith, and it doesn't matter where they're at. And they had actually recently, I think the year before we attended, started a youth track. And, it's interesting because now I think they have over 150 kids that attend, but at the time we went, it was the second year. And I think there was about six or seven kids. And so, it was an intimate space, first of all, for these kids. And they had typically some LGBT couples that were kind of the facilitators that they could kind of look to as mentors and people that could, give them some direction. And you just saw that he was like, oh, there's other people that identify and feel the same way I do. And so for him, it was just like they spoke his language. And, as good as we were as parents, we still didn't really speak the language, and we didn't really understand the same way that he did. And so that was what we kind of saw as this, this light. And, I always call it like the ideal ward, because you had parents, older parents, and, all these different parents that were there. And, they'd go and talk to the youth and ask them how they're doing and, what their interests were, and all those things that you wished it was happening in your own ward. And it was going on in this ward, or, this figurative ward. So for us, it just felt, he fell in love with Catherine Wise, and she has a LGBT son. And then to this day, every time we see them, it's like, Stockton loved you just because you came up to him and were invested.
She just received him as he was. There were no judgments. And I think that was what was so key about that experience. And it wasn't just something that illuminated Stockton, and it illuminated us. Because we were also in a space of trying to find a community that would also receive us, because, Stockton's our family. And so his experience to some degree is also ours. And so, we needed that. So affirmation was a beautiful place for us to, to take a deep breath and feel safe.
Well, and you bring up a good point, because even though you're obviously very supportive parents, it's not like you have a community that has role modeled to you how to, be affirming. And so it sounds like, you're doing the best you can, and you're being very proactive, and you're trying to learn, but it's not your first nature, right? You had to kind of lean into that space. And so it sounds like what you found at affirmation is people who were able to role model that for you and for others, and have it be a really sincere, welcoming space for everyone.
Some of those relationships at that time are some of our most important relationships today. That's how powerful that is.
Yeah. And I love that you say, it felt like, or we wished it was our ward. That's kind of what you hope would happen in church community, especially, right? Is that space. Yeah. All right. So affirmation, you got connected with affirmation prior to 2015, it sounds like, right? Prior to the exclusion policy.
2013, I think.
Okay. So move us along then. What November 5th happens, the leak of the
to
policy.
That, we had finally told Stockton that he no longer needed to attend church, just as a side note. And we'd had another experience with a pioneer trek that Stockton really wanted to attend. Again, he can come, but he has to sleep in his own tent. And George and I, knowing the scout camp.
Goodness grief, I just can't even.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having a reaction. I apologize.
It's okay.
But we, knowing that, we actually went to our bishop right when they announced trek. And I said, hey, I don't want to have any issues with trek. George and I will go in any capacity you will take us. so that I can be there, provide some oversight if you feel like that's necessary, and just make sure, things go well. And no, nothing was ever said to us. And I kind of thought that Stockton had forgotten about Trek and was hoping maybe he just didn't want to go.
He had forgotten about it.
Yeah. And sure enough, I had been out of the country in Africa, and I got back within, like, I'll say a month and a half before they were going. And, sure enough, he says, "Hey, Mom, when's Trek? When am I going to go?"
We're
and I'm
like,
dang.
Oh, man.
So, I'm like offering him, "Do you want to go to the cabin?" I'm trying to kind of deter him, but nonetheless, he wanted to go. So I did kind of the paperwork, and I had mentioned, again, like I said, I grew up in that stake, so I knew a lot of the leaders. And so I got a hold of the parents that were kind of facilitating it and said, "Hey, we've had not a very good experience before. What do I need to do? What do I need to do to make sure we're, good?" And so she kind of said, "Well, let me run it up the flagpole." And it seemed like things were, what kind of triggered it? Anyway, I hadn't got word back that, everything was okay. And so George decided that he was going to make an appointment with the stake president. He called the stake executive secretary, and he asked him what it was regarding. And as soon as he told him it was about Stockton and Trek and just, the LGBT thing in general, he told him that he wouldn't make an appointment for it.
He basically, he said this literally. He said, "I am the gatekeeper, and I will decide what the stake president will attend to." And then said, if every, parent of a gay child, pestered the stake president, we'd never get any of the work done. And
oh my goodness. It's just astounding when I hear these things from my own church community, knowing, what we preach. It's just astounding.
Well, I think they, I don't want to, press the point too much. Actually, I want to press it right to the center. But I think the thing that we have to recognize is that what is our purpose in our faith community? And if we have a space or a group within our community that is being rejected and we're not aligning with the principles of love and gathering and really the gospel, then we got to fix that. And that's really what we were trying to work through is, hey, we have a group in our community that is being segregated. We got to do something about it.
Rachel McKeeve, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, McKeeve, she says, "What? I am floored." And I think a lot of us feel that way. We're
just warming up.
Oh, you're just warming up. Oh, lovely. This is love. But I really appreciate you sharing these very clear examples, because I think, a lot of what I do in my advocacy work is trying to get the word out. And it's so interesting oftentimes when those, especially from within, because we tend to be defensive of our own people, of our own, space, will say that, well, that's, we are loving. That's not true, right? These are not, you're over exaggerating, or you're trying to be a naysayer, and I'm like, no, these are the experiences that people live, on a regular basis. And so just going back to the Trek experience really fast, was he being told that he couldn't attend, or like what? You were trying to get ahead of it, right?
For sure. I was just trying to get ahead of it. And it wasn't that we were told, we really just didn't have any answers. And so we had kind of just gone on a fact-finding mission. The friend of mine that I reached out, she says, "Well, hasn't your bishop talked to you?" And we said, "No." And so that was when George reached out to the stake. And George and I are a blended family, and Stockton is my child that came to the marriage. And so I thought, well, okay, I will call and see if I can make an appointment, because maybe they'll be a little bit more respectful of the fact that he's my child. And so I tried, and I probably spent, and this executive secretary was in our ward, and I probably spent a good hour and a half going back and forth with him. We argued over me saying gay, him saying same-sex attracted. We argued.
Oh my goodness.
Them being that they don't need me to tell them how to handle the LGBT community in our state, that they know how to. And I said, then by all means, share it with those of us that are going through it. If you guys are experts, I welcome it. And we just went round and round and round, and he would not make an appointment for me with the stake president. And so that night, it was a Saturday, I remember specifically, we called and made an appointment for our bishop the next day. And lo and behold, guess who showed up to the appointment? The executive secretary of the state.
And basically, as we walked into that meeting to try to address these issues,
Asked if we could come on track.
asked if we could come on track, and then just this crazy conversation about, trying to help understand that, our LGBT people need, love and acceptance, but also that you don't need to be worried about them. What are you scared about? So that was just, it was just crazy for us to.
And were they saying that they didn't want him to attend? What were they saying?
Him to sleep in his own tent.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Sleep in his own tent, and that I needed to be with him. And
well, no, you didn't on this one. He just needed to sleep in his own tent.
That's right. That's right.
And that the bishop needed to have a special interview with him. And I said, absolutely not. Did you interview everybody else?
Mm-hmm.
And they said no. And I said, then you won't be interviewing my son. And my son won't be, I'm a little sarcastic. So I said, well, I'll whip up a rainbow tent and we can put them all in there. Because I said, what are you doing with all the other kids in the stake that are, gay? And of course, the executive secretary says, oh no, they're same-sex attracted. And they're working with their bishops. And I'm like, oh, so they're safe to sleep in a tent, but Stockton's not because he says he's gay. And that was the differentiator.
Goodness grief. And just the vast, I mean, if you're really worried about sexual happenings between young kids, whether same sex or opposite sex, let's just keep them all in a tent to begin with alone, because there's plenty of kids who don't orient themselves as gay or same-sex attracted that are still fooling around with same-sex
for sure. Well,
friends.
I said that to him. I said exactly that. I said, what are you doing with the straight kids? I mean, when I was at Laurel, the priests in Laurel's that came to Lake Powell were having sex right next to us.
So, I remember kissing a lot of girls practicing in our heterosexual normative.
And so I said, what are you doing with the heterosexual kids? Oh, we want that. We want the flirting, but we don't, because he said, what if he flirts with a boy? And I said, well, what if a girl flirts with a boy? Well, we want that. And I told him, I said, you know what, your biggest problem is going to be that he's going to be over with the girls when it's time to go to bed, and you have to get him over to the boys' tents because his friends are girls. He loves the girls. I said, he may, like we said, he may start a fire and he might
bring
something home, a snake.
Right. These were your main worries.
These were your worries. And when they said that, I looked at him and I said, so I basically shouldn't be alone in the office with you, Bishop, because you're attracted to women and that means you're going to attack women, right? And they look at you like, well, no. And I said, well, Stockton isn't attracted to everybody.
Yeah.
And the attractions need to be mutual.
Shocking the level of assumption and ignorance in these types of.
Quite honestly, I was frustrated because I called the bishop out. I said, you're a high school teacher. I mean, he was at Stockton School. Mm-hmm. And I said, you of all people should have more education and understanding of these young kids being in the role that you are. And, he was the coach, so he didn't take too fondly to being called out a little bit. But nonetheless, I felt like they were doing a very poor job when we had offered them so many times to sit down and understand, to then say, he needs an interview. And ultimately it came down to, the bishop, I wasn't going to relent. I said, well, I'll just tell him he can't go. And of course they're going, well, you can't do that. And I'm like, well, you're saying that. Mm-hmm. And so finally they said, okay, he can go as long as you promise us he'll behave and that you give him, a stern warning. And, I joked that George had a size 12 foot and we'd make sure he's taken care of. And, honestly. But
Stockton didn't need any of that. In fact, the experience that went on was that he had a great experience. One of the particular leaders had commented that.
She actually wrote me a letter.
Yeah, she had been on track. It can be pretty challenging with moving the hand carts, and things. Mm-hmm. And she was moving this hand cart, and of all the youth, and I'm just saying this for context, of all the youth, he was the only one that ran up to her and said, "Can I help?" And he helped her.
Yeah. David UD, if I'm saying that right, or UDI, joined us and says, if the church is an unsafe place for anyone, then it's an unsafe place for everyone, in my opinion. And I think that's a very systemic overview, right? It's you can't just cherry pick who a community is safe for. So I think that's...
Well, I've said often that, it's different. Anything that's different. I was a single mom for 3 years, and, my kids and we were living, on meager income and things. And, people can be pretty rough in those situations. And so it can be anybody that's different. We've had discussions even at a round table with the church where, someone spoke out and said, I have a Down syndrome child and an autistic child, and everybody's good with the Down syndrome child, but not the autistic child. Mm-hmm. And so it comes in lots of different ways,
shapes and forms. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And instead of differences being something that we need to be afraid of or segregate, the power of the difference is that it brings us to a greater level. And really what we were dealing with was a lot of ignorance and an unwillingness to learn and to take that, the information you shared that was available and to learn from it. And I think that we no longer can allow ignorance to, allow us to make decisions that hurt people.
Yeah, it's a very non-humble approach, right? And that's one of the principles we teach a lot is humility, which requires us to be uncomfortable and be willing to be wrong and be willing to learn from others. All of those, things. That's why I always find it so ironic that with the principles that I think are so beautiful in our church community, we oftentimes fail at them pretty significantly.
Well, forget about the power of our journey. Our journey is to learn and to grow. We don't come to this life with everything. We need to learn as we go. And this is part of that.
Yeah. So I guess, like you said, you have many, many examples, and I'm willing to give you as much time to share as many of those as you want. What is Stockton's reaction, right? Are you kind of sheltering him from these conversations that are happening with the leaders, or are you coming home and saying, look, there's some issues here that you need to be aware of, or how's he responding to these concerns about him?
We kind of sheltered him from Trek.
We really, just in our desire to try to keep him safe and allow him
honestly, on Trek, I actually started to worry about him. And so I have a friend that has 2 gay sons that was part of the food, brigade. And I actually called her the night before and I said, I'm really worried about Stockton and how he may be treated. And I said, would you please just keep an extra eye on him? Because, the executive secretary had then gone on to make his Trek mom, pa aware of it, which, like I said, he wasn't out really to everybody. So he made them aware and gave them a stern, direction. And where he got his authority, I don't know. Then he called me and told me that he had made them aware. And then he also told me that I was bordering advocacy and that I was going to lose my temple recommend. And, at that point I said, this really isn't your problem. This is between my bishop and stake president, and you're overstepping your bounds. And I think prior to that too, I had to renew my recommend and finally got into a member of the stake presidency. And at that point, really told him what had gone on and how disappointed and upset that I was. And
yeah, this is a whole nother issue, right, that we really struggle with. I've done many podcasts on boundaries and how confidentiality and how the coming out process, that's the golden rule, right, of the coming out process, is that's a very personal, sacred event that the only person really that should be in charge of that is the individual. And yet, to your point, it's just, lots, and not just with this issue, but this issue in particular is a very, very sensitive one. And for somebody to just be spreading information about your son's orientation when he may not be ready to talk about that or have people know about that is just, it's negligent. It's really it's horrific. I don't really know what words to describe that, but it's really, really bad.
Well, I think the other thing that I think we have to be willing to do is just state it the way it is. Because I think a lot of times we don't want to look at the ugly. And I think that that is a rampant issue in our faith community. And we have to say, look at it and say, this is ugly and we have to fix this. Let's not scrub it, put sugar on it, put some perfume on it to make it smell, look, taste better. Let's say it the way it is so that we can fix it and not ignore it and put the elephant in the corner. We got to fix this stuff.
How is he dealing with that? The idea that people knew things that he wasn't really talking about?
I don't think he really knew. We really didn't, give him all this information.
Mm-hmm.
Right. He knew, classmates knew, and I don't think he would have necessarily cared, but I think in the context that it was being shared, it wasn't being shared in a positive light for sure. And so I think it would have been hurtful because these were his mom and pa were actually in our ward. These were friends that we had done multiple things with. And, I felt like even after that fact, things changed with that family. Mm-hmm. And so that was just really the tipping point, I think, for him and for us being able to say, you can be done. Again, he was still in seminary and had this wonderful seminary teacher his sophomore year. But he only did one semester, whatever they call it, with her. And as soon as they had to start taking like tests and things, he was like, I'm out. I'm not going to take a test on this. But she was really good. She would exchange little notes with her students. And that was something that Stockton connected with. And actually, she sent us some notes after he passed away.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, anything you want to share timeline-wise prior to 2015, November 2015 then? Is that kind of
really
get us up to that point?
Yeah, we were just trying to, take care of our family and love our child. And
you were still actively going yourselves to church?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were attending. We would rotate though. Typically, one of us would stay with him and maybe go do something, or we'd go to sacrament meeting, then come home, just so that he wasn't home alone. Because at that point, our kids were in college, or our girls were in college, and so it was us three. So we would just rotate and maybe hike or do something like that.
Okay, he's your youngest then, it sounds like.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So lead us through the November 2015 timeframe for your family. What was that like?
Well, it was a little unique because my mom was actually dying during that week. They told us to bring her home. She was in a assisted living facility and had been on hospice. And so, our focus had been and was caring for my mom. And the policy came out, and because we were spending a fair amount of time, with my mom, Stockton was with his dad off and on. And so it came out, and I thought, I cannot bring this to his attention right now. I'm not going to say anything to him right this moment because it was just not at the perfect time.
Well, we were just attending to the passing of Alyson's mother. And that was a very challenging time too.
And so he would come up to the house or my sister's house and, see my mom. And on one day he said, well, did you hear about the policy? And I thought, okay, I'm not. And of course we'd heard and we're not happy and frustrated and all the, emotions.
We were in shock.
Yeah. That, everybody was feeling. And so I just simply said, well, what do you think? And he just turned to me and he goes, I'm officially done. And so
he had asked that that his name could be removed from the records of the church at that time.
And we
had 16 by this time, about 15, 16, somewhere in there.
Because he's 16. He turned in May, and that was November. So yeah. And so, of course, I didn't really want to get into this long, because it was during a break, a small break or something. And so I just said, I told him I was really sorry and that we would need to talk about it. I'd love to talk about it more. And so meanwhile, my mom passes away and then we're preparing for a funeral and things. And I remember Stockton, one of the things that really hit him was that, of course, they were being labeled apostates and next to, someone who murders in his mind. And what he was saying is so I'm never going to see grandma again. And, you know, you have to know my mom. I mean, I always said she was the better parent to my kids. Honestly, she's like an angel. And, you know, I think Stockton really was worried that he was never going to see her again. And he was inconsolable, inconsolable at her funeral.
You couldn't hug him enough. I mean, he
just was just bent over, just sobbing. And I kept thinking, yeah, what's going on, bud? What's going on? And
he really thought he was going to go to hell and never see his grandmother again.
And so, you know, that was just, it was heavy. And that day that we buried her, he was just so distraught. And I think you had to leave town that night. And so you left town, and I was in my room with my girls, I think we're up there, and Stockton came up and he said, Mom, I was going to hang myself in the storage room. And he said, but Grandma came to me and told me to come and tell you. And so he came up he told me this. And of course, you know, I'm still kind of, you know, mourning the loss of my mom and the day and all the emotions. And, you know, so I just kind of wrapped him up and said, you know, we'll get you some help. And so he was seeing a therapist and, you know, was on some had been on some medications. And so I called them, you know, as soon as I could, and they met with him and started to tweak some medications and things. And we decided that it might be best for him to go in to a little day treatment program just to help him with anxiety and, you know, just that kind of stuff. And because he was having some suicidal ideation, but they had said that if, you know, we had any issues, then we should, you know, take him to the ER. And so ultimately, because there was a wait list to get into this day treatment, several months. And so, you know, we felt like we were on top of it. He was seeing a therapist. You know, he was communicating more than he had been. And we roll around to June, which was 6 months later. You know, we felt like he was in a really pretty good spot, got done with school. He was ahead. He had taken some classes and gotten ahead. So graduation was going to be really pretty easy. And his therapist literally like the week before had said, you know, I don't think I need to see him every week. I think we can go to every other week. And so, you know, we were thinking, you know, he's doing well. He talked to us about the Friday before. He died on a Monday. The Friday before, he came in and told me that we were going to open They
were going to be business partners.
Yeah, we were going to be business partners, and we were going to open a diner. And I said, gay guys don't open diners.
They do bistros.
They do like bistros or, you know, something chic, but not a diner, you know, bud. And, you know, we were going to make desserts because he loved to make coffee cakes and different things. And, you know, of course I was like, well, what the hell am I going to do? You know, because I don't like to do those things, or not very good at least.
But he had this really well thought out plan. He wanted to get his degree in business so he could understand how to run the business. He wanted to get his culinary, you know, licensing and experience and education. And he was genuinely excited about it. He felt, you know, purposeful in his future.
This was his senior year of high school. That
would have been.
It would have been. It was just after his junior year. So
yeah. So going back to the, you know, the feelings he was having around his grandmother's, you know, death. This is where I think people really need to understand the impact of these narratives and stories that we tell about the eternities, right? And the forever family. And of course, this just came up this last general conference too, with Nelson saying some, I think, very irresponsible and kind of horrific things that can impact people like Stockton.
Sure.
And so even because you've kind of painted him out as like, well, you know, he wasn't that committed to church. He wasn't really that interested. As soon as he started coming across some of these, you know, things where he was being rejected, he kind of, you know, drew some boundaries and said, I'm not going to go as often, or I don't want to be involved. And yet the narrative is still there, right? That story is still there, and people function from that story of, am I a good enough person? Am I worthy? Am I going to be able to be with my family? Am I a sinner? Am I, you know, basically equated to a murderer? These are concepts that you don't just say, oh, I no longer believe, so they don't have any impact on me, right? Or I no longer go to church, so they don't have any impact on me. These are profound stories and narratives that we tell in our community that sound like they were still very real to Stockton, regardless of
mechanism.
Yeah.
It's a coping mechanism. If you reject it, then it can't reject you.
But the reality is that it never really goes away. If you think about the depth of community in the Mormon community, one of the most beautiful things that happens in the Mormon community is that they create community. And so when that becomes your foundation and you feel yourself being literally ripped from it, it's not going to be a good outcome. It's that and not that it can't at some point be moved through and things, but it's going to be a horrendous thing. And I just think that Stockton was experiencing that at such a depth, and with the relationship with his grandmother and how much she was so important to him, that he wanted to see her again.
Right. Brent Sherwood is joining us and says, thanks to you for sharing this story. So
It's nice
to love for you. Well, so let's talk a little bit about, so it sounds like in November, the policy came out. His main reaction was, that's it. That's the end of the straw for me, combined with, of course, his very, personal loss of his grandmother he was very close to. Sounds like you're saying you were reaching out to professional services. I don't know how long you'd been doing that for, right? But he has a relationship with a therapist. He's maybe, been trying some medication for depression. So can you talk a little bit about, what were you noticing, and at what point did you feel like he needed more help than just the kind of, let's talk about it as a family approach and get through a little rough patch?
He was isolating a lot, sleeping a lot, some of those things. He was getting a little bit more vocal and negative about his church, the church in general and his experiences, and, kind of giving us a bit of a hard time for wanting to attend. He had a sister that was going to go on a mission and kind of gave her a little bit of, feedback on his opinion with that. And so we just started seeing, he wasn't doing things. Grades were starting to kind of be affected, maybe missing some classes here and there, those kinds of things. He was, what was it? He was on the swim team, but he was on the varsity swim team and had been on the varsity swim team since 9th grade. And he was, he qualified for state every year. And he was on the cusps of, really doing well in state, and decided he wasn't going to swim again. And, some of the things that were his connectors started to just kind of fall away.
All the things that he'd connected with, were just kind of.
And what kind of time frame are we looking at? Like his junior year, or since from 13 on, or just?
Well, he didn't swim his junior year. So yeah, his junior year, he didn't swim that year.
Yeah, so I think that had been developing before the policy. I think as we, just the experiences that he was having, and just the separation.
And I would say that he probably, he had decided, he wanted to date. And so, that became an issue because you didn't know very many kids that were out, to choose from, because they weren't out. And, I don't think he knew another gay kid in his school. And so that became, I joked that they kind of widened the net, and, he was talking to some older guys, and I was like, what? Nope, that's not good. And so he just was not, he was reaching, he was grasping for his community. He was grasping for something that gave him, connection. And, as much as hanging out with us on Friday and Saturday night is okay, it's not what a teenager wants.
Right.
He wants friendships, and, he wants to be going. And I'll admit, he wasn't great at, I'd say, hey, go to the football game. Well, I hate football. And I'm like, well, you don't go because you're watching the game. You go because your friends are there and you get to hang out with them and go eat after. And, for him, it just became I think, just too much work to really put himself out there and possibly maybe get hurt.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And this time that he shared with you, after coming to you and saying, that he was having really kind of a suicidal plan, and his grandmother came to him and said, go talk to your mom. Was that the first time that you were like, oh my goodness, like we're at that level where, there maybe are some thoughts about dying?
When he very first came out, he kind of made what I would call a
comment.
Weak attempt.
Yeah.
No, he made kind of a weak attempt. He took some Motrin and wrote a letter to George's daughter. And that was when, we finally were like, okay, this is ridiculous. Our son's more important than him being, gay. And so really, after that experience, he just would always say, oh, I would never do anything like that again. And so I really thought that he'd kind of learned his lesson, because I kind of felt like he was crying wolf a little bit then. And so I just didn't feel like, there was times, and that time with my mom passing was a time where, I saw in him that he was down, and, I could have seen why he was feeling that way. But when we were in June, I just, I did not see it. I saw, a kid that he was doing pretty good. I really did feel like he was, doing okay. We were going to move. We just bought a new house. We were going to move him to a different school that was a little bit more affirming. And we knew they were known for their theater program. And a lot of the kids that he had known that were there, had come out since junior high. And so, we were on a good track to get him in a better place, I thought. And I think he thought that. He was excited. He plays the guitar and was writing music and was so excited, to be doing that. He'd always play for us and want, our feedback. And so it just didn't feel like we were in that space.
In that danger zone, or in that space where you have to be extra cautious.
Shooting was a week or 2 weeks prior to him
in Orlando, the Pulse Club.
Mm-hmm.
And, but I didn't see it. I did see that he was, I do know that he was, luckily I have enough connection in the LGBT community that they would look after Stockton. And he was possibly on some sites he shouldn't have been on that I was aware of. And he knew that I was on into him. He could never figure out how I always knew. And I'd always joke that I had eyes in the back of my head. And
he does. She does.
So, I knew he was flirting with some things that probably weren't going to lead him, in a good space. But overall, we felt like he was doing well.
Right. And you kind of brought up, sorry, go ahead.
We had actually, he was going to graduate, in 2017. And so we actually, the week before, we were taking all of our kids to Europe at the end of that, it was senior year. And we had actually just booked our trip to the Mediterranean because he wanted to pick the stops, which included Greece. And so we had actually just booked that trip.
Yeah, with them.
So I'm thinking, he's, we've got this trip to look forward to. And
these are one of the things that are just so maddening about death by suicide, is that it would be nice, if we had a clear-cut idea, right? Or could see it coming. Obviously we have some typical warning signs, and of course in hindsight, sometimes it's easier to see some of those things, but there's just the reality that for many families, many people, there just really isn't a very good explanation, and
I agree. I would say, I always use, the example of layers when I talk about his death. I feel like there was layers, and, people will say, well, do you think it was the church's fault? And I'll say, no, but they put layers on. And we should be about taking those layers off, not adding them. Mm-hmm. And we didn't take them off. We added them. And you never know what layer is going to be the last one. We do know we were in St. George and he was with his dad, and he and his dad got in a pretty significant fight the night before. And so we knew that he was not, his dad was not pleased with him. And so we knew that things had gone down, but I didn't, think that they were to that degree, I guess. Yeah. I mean, we didn't have, this was coming from dad to us, through text. And so, we didn't have a lot of gory details until after the fact.
I think the part of the conversation and Alice and I spent a lot of time with Stockton, taking him to and from therapy appointments and trying to help him.
Sleeping in our room.
Yeah, he was, he slept on our floor for a long time. And so, Stockton was the sidekick in so many different ways. And we had very intimate conversations about things. And as much as I felt like there was a lot of really healthy things going on for him with therapy and some medication to support challenges, depression and things, the real cold reality is that, I knew him well enough that he hated pain.
Yeah, he wouldn't get shots.
He wouldn't get shots. Everybody hates pain. So, just understand what I'm trying to say is he hated physical pain. And I think we all hate physical pain, but, Stockton just despised it, even the smallest of pain. And so as I knew him as well as I did, I realized, of course, after the fact, he must have been in a space that was too much. And I think there has to be an accounting for that and some reverence for that. And so, as much as we felt that he was in a good place, Stockton was really good at hiding things, keeping us away from what was going on inside of him. And I think that finally broke.
You make so many good points as far. I really appreciate your layering comment, Alyson. I think a lot of times we want to blame one thing, and these things that lead to depression and suicidality are complex and they are layered, and there's lots of different perspectives. I think that we can squarely hold the church kind of policy and community and kind of culture as squarely responsible for being a significant layer.
Absolutely.
At the same time, it's not probably fair or it's not really true to just, be one-sided, right? And only look at that one thing. I was going to ask prior to you mentioning some things about his biological dad, and he's not here to represent himself, so I don't necessarily want to spend a lot of time on that, but was he somebody who was affirming of, Stockton's orientation and things of that nature? Or was he having a hard time from that perspective as well? I don't know if that's something you
No, he was affirming.
About. Okay.
He was affirming. It was more that Stockton was, being kind of a teenager, sneaking out, doing things that, we were accustomed to, but Dad wasn't quite as accustomed to.
Yeah. Stockton was with us, 99% of the time. So we knew him very well. Yeah.
So, it was kind of Dad was finally experiencing some of the same things that I kept telling him he was doing at our house.
Right.
So he was a little, I think, taken aback that Stockton would do that to him as well.
Yeah. And it is hard when you have those, like I said, like teenage life is hard already, right? There's some rebellion already that most kids are doing. That I don't know a lot of kids that are like, oh, let me do this chore and I'm super helpful and super excited to keep all the rules. In fact, I kind of worry about those kids a little bit when they're too conforming for other reasons. And yet, when you have, again, that's just one layer of all this other pain and sadness that he's feeling. And so, you're when you're upset with him about this particular things that most parents would get upset about or, push back on, you're pushing back already on a more complex situation to begin with. Right. And so
for sure,
that's hard for you as parents. One thing that you mentioned too, that I just kind of want to give you a chance to think about or may talk about, it sounds like he was a little bit upset at the two of you, or maybe his sister, for continuing to congregate with or be a part of an organization, a church that he found hurtful. And I've heard this a lot, from my clients, is like from faith transitioners or from feminists or from, gay people, lesbians. It's like, why would my loved ones still associate with my abuser, with the people that hurt me or the people who reject me? Why would they do that? And that's a very complex concept, right? And I know many of us stay associated with the church in many ways, trying to change or be a positive influence within, and so those are very complex thoughts and stories that we make. So do you want to speak to that a little bit as far as how you responded to that, or how you felt about the fact that he was upset that you were still actively engaged?
I think, the one, as far as his sister going on a mission, which ironically she came home a week later, but, and all said and done, she wouldn't have been here when Stockton passed away, nor her grandma, had she not come home. So to us, we felt like that was a little bit of, of a blessing, because I think she would have been just sad as could be to not be with Stockton or have had, that chance to see him. And, I would approach it usually with, Kylie, our daughter, is respectful of, you and your community and the things that you desire. And so all I'm asking is that you give her that in return. And, we had a lot of conversations when Kylie was going on her mission about, sticking up for the LGBT community and, making sure that she was looking after the one, if you will, and, what approach she was going to take as she served her mission. And I think George and I were also somewhat in there to help other parents or to find, the other Stocktons and to participate and make a difference for someone else. I mean, we didn't stop knocking on the door of our leaders, and we didn't stop, trying to meet and educate. We just continued to say, we're going to be here and we're going to make it known that we need to be better. And so he was okay. And because we'd spend time with him, I didn't feel like, every week he was going, I can't believe you're going to that lousy place. I think he just was like, how dare they?
Yeah, I think he also, part of our interaction with him was to let him know that, just be patient with us, because we don't know what it feels like to be gay in a community that rejects you. We don't know what that really feels like. So we want to understand that. We want to have, a deep empathy for what he was dealing with. And I think the one thing about our son is that he wanted things right now, and he wanted things to change, and he wanted us to get up to speed. And so we have, jet vapor trying to keep up with him, and so we were drinking from a fire hydrant, and gladly so. But we were trying to understand things and be there for him and make sure that our loyalty was in the right place. And I think that he knew it. He would say things like, you tell my mom to stop loving me so much, and things like that, And so I think he knew where our hearts and loyalty was to him. And
right.
Yeah.
So can you talk, I know we've kind of jumped ahead into June, but before we even get, because I'm assuming June is when he died, correct? Is that what you're getting at? So before that, can you, and I know you were going through your mother's, death as well and all that, but can you speak just briefly about what it was like for the two of you, once you had maybe some time to kind of catch up in regards to the original policy leak and how that all kind of ended up playing out in the next few weeks and months? And what, because you're obviously also very involved in these communities, Affirmation, Mama Dragons and such. What were you noticing or seeing? What were you experiencing, not only personally, but maybe as part of this larger community?
Alyson and I, rapidly dove into the community when Stockton came out and with Affirmation and things. And so, we just wanted to understand. And so, by the time the policy came out, the LGBT community and Affirmation and other organizations really became our family. One, because we wanted to be educated and knowledgeable and empathetic. But two is that, we wanted to, be there for this community for a lot of different reasons. And so, when the policy went off, it was like a bomb. It was like a big bomb went off, and seeing all these people that had wanted so desperately to feel part of this, to be in the community, in the Mormon community, and it's just like a bomb went off, and there's people laying in the streets, and it was devastating.
I, from the get-go, didn't feel it was right. There was nothing in that felt loving, that was going to bear any positive fruit. And I immediately wrote a letter and sent it to my stake president as well as our bishop, and expressed concern for the policy and the effects that it would have, and the effects that it had already had. So I wrote it maybe a week after, and probably thinking, because I had done a few other media pieces before, and I'm sure I was on their radar, but for whatever reason, they were somewhat leaving me alone. I think President Eyring was in the stake, and I think they just kind of wanted to keep it on the DL, because if they brought it about, I probably would have been a little bit more public. And because I would often question the stake president when I got to meet with him, I would say, I really don't think President Eyring would be happy with this. I know the Eyrings, I know how kind they are. And he'd just say, well, this is what they've said we're going to do, so this is what we're going to do. President Eyring's in the stake, and we don't want him to get word that we're doing anything that we're not instructed to do. And so I thought, this letter was going to probably put me over the edge, because I was pretty vocal, and, not one word.
At the time we were trying to navigate a lot of different things, but no question, not divine, not revelation. That policy is a complete opposition to the principles of the gospel. And so there can be no truth in that. And that's just, when that came out, I didn't have to think about that.
Yeah.
I knew that's what it was.
Well, and for those of us following it closely, it was almost laughable to see how they didn't expect the leak. They kind of scrambled with their responses. There wasn't the classic unanimous approaches that they take. And then they tried to say that there were. I mean, it was just like watching a bit of a circus that was at the expense of this beautiful community that's already suffering, right? Already feeling very rejected, having maybe little glimpses of hope that maybe we're moving in the right direction prior to this, and then this comes crashing down. I really appreciate your metaphor of a bomb. I mean, it was very distressing on so many levels to see the results of this. Yeah. I don't necessarily want to spend any more time than you want to, but I do want to give you an opportunity to talk about June if you want, or we can move on to a different question as far as your experience with the suicide of your son.
Well, yeah. I think that was one of those experiences I mean, I really didn't see it coming. I can't say it enough. I didn't see it coming. We were out of town. I knew that Stockton had upset his dad, and I knew that, I think he had lied to him and gone with someone that he didn't. He said he was going with someone and went with someone else, and he had tried to sneak out the night before. And so I knew that he was still kind of being a character. And so I was concerned. That, what are we going to do? How can I help him? And so for me, I simply, was up all night the night before, and finally sent a text to his dad asking him not to leave him alone that morning, and then to get him to work, and then we would be home and pick him up from work. And
so you were worried because there had been this altercation between them.
Yeah, I was. I was worried, and I couldn't have pinpointed what. I didn't feel like he was going to take his life. I was unsettled about it. I just couldn't sleep. I mean, I think it was 4 a.m. that I finally decided, okay, I'm going to send this text, and then I'm going to try to go to sleep, because I was just, I was just unsettled. And so we were there seeing our daughter we were in St. George, seeing our daughter who attends Dixie State. And so she was at the hotel visiting me while George was in some meetings, and George received the call and had to come over and tell my daughter and I that Stockton had attempted. At that point, we didn't know that he had passed away. And I just remember, complete shock. And of course, my daughter was, a mess. And here we are 6 hours away from home. Our other daughter is home. And, it was she's
trying to do triage and just deal with all
I'm trying to get someone to, be with my daughter, to take her to the hospital, because, we want her there. And it just was, it was, you can't imagine it. It's just absolutely, I've replayed it a million times in my head. Like Georgia said, it breaks my heart that he felt that alone, that he felt like that was the only solution to his problem. We didn't leave things on a great note. We were, like we said, we were moving, and we'd asked him to pack one box before he went with his dad. It was just a little coat closet, and he was being stubborn with his sister and, didn't do it. And dad came and he left. So of course, sister had told him, he was rude and shouldn't do that. And he called us, and we had kind of gotten upset with him because he had broken a window and we just paid like $250 to fix it. And so we had told him that if he couldn't help us, that he could pay for the window. And so, none of it was left on really, positive terms. And so we caught a flight and got home and before we got home, they had taken him off life support. And, we didn't make it back in time to, see him again, other than just after he passed away. And, I don't know. He and I were always kind of like water and oil, but yet, we were two peas in a pod because we spent all our time together. I had quit working to help care for my parents, and then I felt like he needed extra attention. And so everything I did was in and around Stockton. And so I felt like, it's like this piece of your heart is gone. No one can make up the difference. It's a quarter of my heart is physically gone. And it didn't have to be, but I just, I felt so you're just numb. You can't explain it. You're just numb. You just kind of go through the motion. And then we're trying to plan a funeral, and we're
in the process of moving.
We're in the process of moving. And,
we were also still dealing with the effects of that. Alyson's mother had passed away 6 months previous. And, you don't just walk away from that, and the deep effect and, the influence she had on every one of us, and especially Stockton and all the kids. And so, in that process, and I think I have to say, I really appreciate the fact that you would even note or offer up the opportunity to talk about this. It's not something that we walk up to and want to talk about this. But I think that that we have to be given permission, even basically ourselves, but also in any space, so that we can talk about these things. Because when we stop talking about them, and I think that really was what was so, I don't even know how to really say it. I haven't really truly responded to the change in the policy, because I don't think anything really changed.
Well, our life's still devastated.
Yeah, so I think that the fact that you would even open up a space for Alyson and I to make these comments about his passing says a lot about the way it really ought to be. And instead of running away from deeply painful things, which includes communities that might have some level of effect on Stockton making that decision, we have to talk about those things. And, for us, our lives are permanently altered. A life that, when I said this before, and I'll say it again, one of the most beautiful things that God ever did for me is that he gave me a gay son. And so the reality of our lives is that I didn't get to see him graduate from high school. I didn't get to see him go to college and live out the dream and the plan that he had prepared just a few days before his passing. And I don't get to see him married, raising some children. Those are things I really wanted to see. And I not only wanted to see, but I wanted to love and support. And so that is my reality. And I think that in the sense of the principles that we all have been taught in the gospel is that we love each other in all of our differences and experiences. And so that's my difference. That's my experience. And I'm not going to hide from that. But at the same time, I'm not going to act like everything's just fine when it isn't.
Thank you, George, for sharing all of that. Alyson, anything else that you want to say? Or
no, it's just it's a very difficult dynamic. It's a difficult dynamic. And, you talk about the role of the church and our wards and those things. And, this path, I always, when I speak, I'll say, if my son had cancer, my ward and family would rally. They would rally, they would bring food, they would do all of those things. But when your gay child takes his life, it becomes a different scenario. I've never been, as much as our ward rallied with food and, those kinds of things, I've never also felt such immense pain having to feel so isolated from those things. I mean, I'm sure you're aware when an LGBT youth and or adult probably, but I've seen it with youth, takes their life in Utah, it becomes very quickly a very public thing. And oftentimes has with us had a very negative effect. We received hate mail, we received people reaching out to my kids, telling us if we didn't like the church to leave because, people were saying, angry at the church. And none of which, really came from us. But I also felt their pain and I understood where they were at and why they felt that way. And, we had frustration even planning the funeral. And so I understood that, but I just, I have family that still hasn't talked to me since Stockton died. And we're going on 3 years over this situation. And
can you explain a little bit about what that's about? Is it they see suicide as a sin, or that they feel like you're blaming the church for?
It's more. We had an experience when the policy came out, and had an experience with a family member, and it got weaved into a conversation during the passing of Alyson's mother, and but her family member just flat out said, kind of asked our thoughts, and at the time there was no hesitation, and I just said that there's nothing good about this. This is not the hand of God. It's not divine. God doesn't operate like that. He just does not do these things. And that kind of created a bit of a firestorm that at some point, moved down the path of a conversation that Alyson had, and ultimately became what it is today, and just complete silence. And
it's splintered my entire family. I have 5 siblings, and it has become a very splintering.
All members of the church, like this is a.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, George and I are currently taking a bit of a break from church, and I feel as equally strongly about their behavior affecting that decision as I do the LGBT things. Because I can't fathom that we would treat one another this way. And I've made half a dozen, if not more, attempts to talk through it and work through it. And
all from this guise of like, you're not willing to follow our leaders or be obedient, or
no, it was more just, how we handled maybe I honestly, because they won't talk to me, I honestly couldn't tell you for sure. I'm kind of guessing. I mean, I did say I know I said some things. I had said some things that that were truths, but, kind of called them out a little bit. And that's not in their nature to take that. And I realized that, it was a week after I buried my son, and we were in some situations where, things were being said public. We had people giving us backlash. People were then trying to, say, oh, he didn't take his life because of the church. He took his life because of this, and that we're divorced parents. And a lot of the information was getting filtered through these family members. And so I finally confronted it.
There was a massive amount of deflection. It couldn't have been a layer of the church, and it couldn't have been a layer of the policy. It couldn't have been that.
But it could have been
had
that
to be
we're divorced.
Because we're divorced, and divorced families are dysfunctional. So, and it literally had been said to us, through the grapevine, that Stockton took his life because our family had dysfunction.
So in a sense, it's almost this inability to take any responsibility for the hurt or the pain or the empathy of being part of an organization that is hurting LGBTQ folks. It's like,
oh yeah,
and any type of complaint or critique about that hits too personal. Then it's my response. Then I have to look at it. Then I'm part of maybe why, this decision was an option for Stockton, and there's no way that can be the case. And so I'm going to step away completely and then actually be part of a family cutoff at a time of deep family tragedy.
Yeah. And there was a bit of a wedge between Stockton's dad and myself, because, I had specifically asked him not to leave him alone. And I was trying to kind of just digest all of that. I didn't want to be angry because I knew what he had gone through. I knew, that he found him and it was his home. And to me, that is something I'm thankful I'm not carrying. And so I really was trying to be methodical in the way that I navigated that relationship, because I didn't want to hold any hate or malice, but yet there was definitely a fair amount of frustration. Mm-hmm. And so it became kind of a wedge. It just didn't need to be, though. It just didn't need to be. There's a better way to work through things, and there's a better way to navigate as a family. And this isn't the way I would choose to do it. And I don't believe it's the way we're intended to do it as a family.
I think that once a little bit of additional reflection on the nature of the policy. It's crazy what happens when you practice what you preach and what you don't practice. And I think that in a community where we've been raised and felt so deeply connected to the eternal nature and capacity of our family, and then you're taught to believe that because of the actual way my son is, that he won't be with us for eternity. And then to think that because I feel so incredibly indifferent to that type of divisive language, that my loyalties are in the wrong place. And at the end of the day, that type of behavior speaks more loudly than the space we really should be operating in. And so for us, my son's divine creation is not divisive. It won't separate us.
Well, and I think what you're referring to is that if you preach divisive doctrine, then we can't be surprised when we act that way as a community.
Right.
Well, I mean, if somebody comes up to you and starts stabbing you with a knife, you're supposed to stand there and be okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Alyson.
It is what it is. We've just, we've again found, those that will sit at the table with us and who will mourn with us. And we've really found out what our foundation is and what it means. And so for us, it's more clearly defined, the type of people that we want to include in our lives. And it's just more clearly defined that for us, who will be with us when the going gets tough. And
I think the interesting thing for us is that it really cleaned off a lot of things for us. And both Alyson and I have a deep love and reverence for the gospel. We love our Father in heaven and our Savior, and we appreciate deeply what He's provided us with. And so, the reality is that we're trying to navigate this life and do the things that are best for our marriage and our family, and support those principles that, keep us together forever.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I've kept you way longer than I said I would. I hope you don't mind going another 10 or
George is long-winded.
Yeah.
Well, I just keep on asking questions. I'm like, well, what about this? So I guess, can we move into, and maybe you've already answered this in some ways, but what, so a week ago, there's kind of like, another announcement, right? So kind of reversing the exclusion policy, no apology, no over the pulpit, just over the newsroom, kind of a quick announcement that you can read. Maybe one sentence about, I think they said something like people have been affected, something that, if you read into it, they realize there's been some harm here, but they didn't really come out and say that. Any response as far as, like you said it very well, it doesn't make a difference. You're still devastated. Your family will never be the same. Stockton is, gone from this life. And how do you make, I guess that's where my rage is coming from, right? Because I sit with people in your situations often, or a situation similar to that. And so it just feels like very dismissive to me. But what was it like for you?
I was sad. I felt like, my first response is, well, it changes nothing for us. A little too late, type scenario, and several other people that lives have been affected and who we've lost in the community. And it's kind of a little bit of this, we've been trying to tell you for, how long. And then, I think my 2-word response to, or 3-word response to George was, you can't applaud humanity. Basic humanity. This is not something that should have been placed in the first place. So for wanting to applaud something that they did of their own making, to me, just isn't enough. That's no apology for the lives that have been affected, the impact it's had on so many people. And to think that, they can take down the stumbling block that they put up and all is well is just minimizing the whole issue.
Yeah, it's feeding the big elephant in the corner. And I think that really what happened for Alyson and I at that moment, we're committed to the community. And, we feel ourselves in that admonition, of the Savior himself, where he, left the 99 and went after the one. And so, what we found is that we got a lot of work to do. And there's a lot of people that are, hurting and are feeling, even more deeply wounded by what exactly happened. That there was really no acknowledgement of anything. And if anything, it was kind of like a little storm that rolled by and like it never happened. And I think that that's so not true.
I make the metaphor. I really appreciate your thoughts, Alyson, about we can't really applaud this. I work with domestic violence issues and abuse and things. And And even the, kind of the imagery you had said, George, about, when somebody's stabbing you, you don't say, oh, thank you for stopping stabbing me, right? You just, that's not something that we like applaud. If people at that point are willing to say, okay, I realize I've got a problem and I really shouldn't be stabbing people and I shouldn't be doing this, and I'm willing to do the work to improve and to really understand myself, we start applauding at that point, right? When people are really willing to do that kind of change, moving from somebody who's willing to hurt to somebody who is self-aware and can, be reformed. And we call it, in the prison system, we call this reforming, right? Reforming people. So yeah, so it's quite concerning when the church, in the sense, the church leadership has been acting as an abuser to the LGBTQ plus community, to then feel like this is progress. This is, obviously this had to happen. This was not a sustainable step they took. Just like I say, continuing to beat your wife or be emotionally belittling is not sustainable to any relationship. Right. And now hopefully, we would see the humility to do the work to really make progress. But that's a process. And I don't know, they're not really giving indications that that's the direction they want to move in.
Well, and I think, as you take responsibility for the space that you were given in your life, is that for Alyson and I, we learned very really quickly that we needed to venture out and find, connect with heaven and say, what can we do? And so that's what we're about. I think if I would leave any message to any, other than what we already shared, the message I would leave is that, your family, your children, however they come, are your number one responsibility. And when you are walking by an individual and they're in pain, there is no excuse for walking by that individual and not acknowledging that pain, receiving that pain, and then doing everything in your power to support the healing of that pain.
Yeah, and that kind of leads us to the last question I want to ask you both, is the space of, why would you come on a show like Mormon Mental Health Podcast and have this conversation with me? I mean, we want to hear your story. We want to hear anything you bring to the table, but it's much more, it's, I think your purpose for coming here is a lot more than just venting, right? You're not just venting. You have plenty of spaces to vent in your personal lives that are much more, I think, I would imagine much more fulfilling for the two of you than to speak to me, whom you barely know, right? So what is there's lots of people that you might reach out to at this point. There's church leaders and there's a difference, I think, too, between like the church leadership, right? The church office building. Then there's local leaders, right? Who a lot of them actually listen to programs like these. Then there's parents. And then there's, of course, LGBTQ plus individuals themselves, right? So not that you need to speak to all of those entities, but maybe if you have some closing thoughts about why you speak up, what you've learned about good mental health practice, what you've learned about good community, who would you want to reach out to and say, these are kind of closing thoughts, and this is what I hope, this pain and this story that we've been through can hopefully be, something that can help others.
So I think it's really important to note that the number one reason we're here is that you asked. You asked. And I think that there's a great deal of importance in the fact that you asked. And so if I were to leave with a thought, is ask. If you're a bishop, if you're a parent, if you're a stake president, if you're whoever you are and you see and know somebody in the community, simply ask, what can I do for you? Please help me understand how you feel. And connect with that. And I think that there's so much crazy power in asking and giving a space. You're handing an opportunity for somebody to respond, and you're giving them permission to in a safe space. And I think that was what I would say is that the example of what you just did and asked us if we would talk, it is a game changer. Thank you. That's very meaningful for me to hear you say that. I
I struggle sometimes, with asking, because I don't want people to feel pressure, or like we're sensationalizing your story, or, things that sometimes people can critique. But at the same time, I want to hear your story. I know other people want to. I want to understand better, and I want to help our community do better. Right. So thank you so much for being willing to accept the invitation and teaching us so much along the way.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
I think for me, I personally, I don't want Stockton's memory to be in vain. I think that I do the things that I do probably daily in hopes that he's proud, that he's happy, that if we can make a difference in someone else's life by providing them some love and support that maybe they aren't having at this point in time in their lives, that
we bring him back to life.
We can be that, balm for them. And, I always say this, we do a dinner. In fact, today we have a dinner where we have LGBT millennials come. And, they always say, thank you. And I'm like, they have no idea what that does for us.
Yeah, very healing.
To see them thrive, to see them, have people to be with that understand where they're at, and to have these fun interactions just absolutely changes, our day. As you can tell, our house is really quiet. And
too quiet.
Yeah, we're not accustomed to this really quiet home. And so I just have such a love and respect for the LGBT community, and hope that in some small way we will prick, allies' hearts, or parents' hearts, or leaders' hearts to really lean in and get to know these kids and understand them for who they are. I just have seen the pain this last week that they have felt. And, I know today will be another day where they will be able to process and, share their feelings. And my heart just breaks. And I just, I can't see another family or person go through what we've experienced without sharing, what we've had and what we've experienced.
Thank you. Rachel McCleve says, beautiful. Thank you both for sharing. And again, there's been a lot of hearts floating up into the Facebook Live aura. So as you've both been talking, lots of tears, the tear emoji as well, and lots of emotion, I think, being felt by those who are listening and sharing of this experience with you. So thank you so much for your honesty, your vulnerability, your emotion, your just showing up with me. And I've really enjoyed my time with the two of you. I hope that our paths can cross in other areas as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. We would love that.
Yeah, for sure.
Come and join our
there is
monthly
room
dine and dash.
And there's room in our inn if you need a place to stay.
Oh, awesome. That's don't offer things you might be scared I'll take you up on.
We have very little fear, my friend.
No, and I loved your imagery of having these, young people in your home, in essence, living, what you had hoped to see Stockton live. And I think that's a wonderful way to honor his memory, and in a way kind of, share with him this energy that could have been. So, by the way, I love the idea of a gay diner. So
right.
Maybe it was amazing.
Maybe if my skills improve, I'll open one in his honor, right?
Yeah. Like it's almost like the diner, but kind of like with a little bit of posh to it,
Yeah.
So I can just totally see that.
Yeah.
That's right. The diner with no bellyache.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, for those of you who have hung in there with us, thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you enjoy or find value in Mormon Mental Health Podcast, please consider a donation or a Facebook like on the page or a positive review. All of those things would be very helpful for me to keep this sustainable. This is kind of like I just like people kind of, have to navigate their own relationship with the church. Well, this is my self-given calling that I've given to myself. So
yeah.
This is how I
love it. I think it's great.
But there are costs associated, and there's people I try to pay along as, kind of reimbursing myself for some of my time as well. We have a nice comment here from Brent Sherwood. He says, you both make a tremendous impact I can't count the number of times I felt loved and inspired over the years as you have shared part of yourselves and your story. Thank you again. You're a gift to so many. So that's a beautiful place to end then. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Take care and take care of yourselves and each other. Have a good one.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
As a mother stills her child, thou canst hush the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me.
Boisterous wave, obey thy will. When thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear thee say to me, fear not, I will pilot thee. Twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not,